At this point, we are, in a sense, shifting gears from labor to land use regulation. The history buffs among us will no doubt be reminded of the Republican Party platform from 1856. Free soil, free labor, free men. So we started out with the labor. We're now moving to free soil. And after the last talk is over, we will all be free men and can go. So the talk, our next presentation is by Nicole Garnett from Notre Dame Law School.
Thanks a lot. Today, this is a little out of step with some of the other papers. I think most of the other papers are about mostly federal policy and federal law, and I'm going to talk about state and local policy, in large part because Michael asked me to talk about land use regulation. That's mostly a state and local issue. I'm going to talk about, in particular, two things and their intersection: inner ring suburbs and the new urbanism, and in particular, the regulatory alternative that new urbanists are promoting to replace traditional zoning rules, which is popular among inner ring suburbs, for a reason I'll talk about. I've actually written a lot about land use planning. Much of it has focused on the idea of order and disorder, and some of it on the intersection between land use and policing in efforts to promote order and to suppress disorder. Just a little bit about my priors. I am suspicious of regulation, especially overregulation, which I tend to have a capacious definition of. I'm no fan of traditional zoning, and I tend to share the new urbanist aesthetic preferences, but I'm not a fan of their efforts to impose them through the law. I'm interested in both cities and suburbs. I'm interested in suburbs mostly in land use regulation. Not many people are interested in suburbs, except for people who favor restricting their growth. But I'm interested in suburbs because I think they're very underappreciated, interesting places. I grew up in the suburbs in Kansas City, although I live in what passes for an urban neighborhood now in South Bend, Indiana. I'm interested in inner ring suburbs in particular because they're very interesting places. They're funky, diverse places where 1/5 of Americans live, and where there's a lot of, in the popular commentary and in legal literature and among some economists and sociologists, there's sort of an alarmism about entering suburbs. I'm not very alarmist about them, and even though there are some apparent problems there, but I am suspicious sometimes that the alarmism is used as an excuse to advocate for redistributional land use policies and anti-growth policies that I like less than zoning. One little side is I am not going to attempt to define what an inner ring suburb is. I'm using the literature, whatever the people who have written statistics about it, whatever definition they use. It is actually not an easy term to define, because if you say inner ring means those suburbs that border on or touch cities, you get a very different picture than if you have a different, bigger definition that says those suburbs who have an exterior boundary that stops their growth through annexation in metropolitan area. Okay, so a little bit about inner ring suburbs. So like I said, they're home to about 1/5 of all Americans. They're very diverse places in a diversity of ways. Some of them are among the most wealthy communities in the United States. This is Winnetka, Illinois, Mission Hills, Kansas, and Sausalito in California. Some of them are among the poorest. So after the Ferguson riots, there was quite a bit of uptick in sort of alarmism about inner ring suburbs. Some suburbs like Ferguson are a majority minority, very, very poor, very depressed. Most inner ring suburbs are actually in the middle. This is Overland Park, Kansas, where I grew up. That's the house my parents used to live in. So this modest neighborhood, that on average, inner ring suburbs are wealthier than the national average, about 25% higher in median income. Their property values are slightly higher. The national average, although certainly not as high as places farther out, they are aging, both in terms of residential age and infrastructure. And they are home to, they're very diverse. About a majority of racial minorities now live in the suburbs. One reason I'm quite interested in suburbs. And including about 50% of African Americans in the largest metro area. And most of the suburban population gain over the past 2 decades was actually attributable to minority migration to suburbs. And they are home to millions and millions of immigrants. About 61% of immigrants in 2014 lived in suburbs, up from 50% in 2000. And the available evidence is strongly suggests that increasing numbers of immigrants are going straight to the suburbs. They are not going to the center cities anymore. My Afghani Uber driver yesterday, who spent almost a decade as a translator for the U.S. Army, a very admirable guy, told me that all the Afghanis here in the D.C. area live in suburban Virginia, where they have everything they need, including restaurants and mosques. So most people in the legal literature, at least, who view the problem of entering suburbs in distributional terms, according to this story, entering suburbs are victims of a system of local government law that sort of landlocks them and leaves them unable to address problems that are created by their neighbors. This is a picture of Chicagoland. If you ignore the dark blue, which is actually Chicago, all of the names on this metropolitan area are separate municipalities, except for the dark blue is all neighborhoods in Chicago, so that's not perfect. So what you see by this picture is that the Chicagoland is made up of hundreds of municipalities that spans 3 states. So the way American local government law works is that essentially municipal incorporation is self-executing. So if you can get enough people together, you can get a government, as my judge liked to say, government. Once you get a government, you have certain very important powers, including taxation and land use regulation, and the power to annex until your neighbors annex defensively in order to keep you from annexing them, in which case your powers of taxation and land use regulation stop at your boundaries. You cannot, one municipality in the United States cannot annex land that is incorporated. So the story, the distributional account is that this is a very inefficient, irrational system that leaves a lot of local governments powerless to address the outward pull of resources to the farther suburbs, that leaves them powerless to address sort of ruinous competition of their neighbors, and among the inner ring leaves them with lots of problems that they're unable to pay for. I don't actually pretend that this is a rational system. It is not something anybody would dream up. I don't pretend that this is the efficient number of local governments for the Chicagoland area. But one problem with the distributional account is the reality that economists have shown over and over again that Charles Chiba's market for consumer voters actually does work. So increasing these little governments do compete with one another for residents. There's evidence that the average property taxation, for example, goes down as the number of municipal governments in a metropolitan area goes up. The same thing is actually true of test scores and school districts. Carolyn Hawksby has proven this to be true, that the more school districts there are, the average test scores go up because there is competition. So I don't have anything to say about that critique. I'm just going to leave it to the side. I'm mostly interested in what I might call the aesthetic critique of entering suburbs, and that is the view that part of the problems, many of the problems facing entering suburbs are not just distributional, but sort of built into the very fabric of the built environment, excuse the jargon, of the place. Lots of commentary on entering suburbs are riddled with references to aesthetics. They're described as aging, unappealing, lifeless, and there's lots of references to the undesirability of split-level houses and ranch-style housing, and ugliness of strip malls, deadness of malls. These things make it harder for suburbs to compete with other suburbs as well as urban areas which are experiencing a comeback. Not all entering suburbs have aesthetic problems. Many of the wealthiest suburbs have very nice, aesthetics. They're like Winnetka, Illinois. The first suburbs, the oldest suburbs, tend to have sort of a built environment that is preferred by elites. Older suburbs, the second ring, tend to have the ugly split-level ranch style malls and everything else that the critics bemoan. And so there is this idea that in order to make suburbs competitive, they need to be urbanized. So I think entering suburban leaders undoubtedly understand their woes, both in distributional and aesthetic terms, but they can't do much about the distributional problems other than band together with other entering suburbs and try to get redistributional policies and growth controls and tax redistribution. But they do have the power to regulate land uses. And this is where the new urbanists enter into the story. So over the past 25 years or so, this group of planners and architects have launched a very successful campaign that critiques suburbia and land use planning practices in the United States on aesthetic terms. They hate in particular suburbs and Euclidean zoning, and they have a sort of aesthetic and cultural critique of suburbs, which I find somewhat alluring and somewhat convincing. But they more recently, and I will actually say, I was actually an early fan of the new urbanism. I kind of like the aesthetic. I thought that the critique of zoning was sort of spot on, but early on they lacked a legal mechanism to impose it. That was sort of the problem. It was just kind of an interesting cultural critique. But they've come up with one, and that is where my enthusiasm for the new urbanism waned. These codes that I'm going to describe in a second that are promoted by the new urbanists that will try to retrofit suburbia through the law are attractive to inner suburban leaders precisely because they can implement them on their own, because they have permission to implement land use planning from the state through the zoning enabling acts. So they can hope to implement these codes that will retrofit suburbia and attract these sort of hipsters that they believe are flocking in droves to cities. That may or may not be true. I mean, the hipsters do live in cities now, maybe more than they used to, but I think the economists are questioning how much it's really, how sustainable or how big the phenomenon really is, but they believe that there are these hordes of hipsters out there just waiting to come to hip urban places. And if they can just retrofit themselves, they too can be hip. Okay. So anyway, so a little bit about the code. So as I said early on, the cultural critique of suburbia was simply that it was very privatizing and that architecture sends cultural messages, that certain kinds of architecture build community, certain kinds of architecture are antithetical to community, and that zoning, by dividing up land uses by function, was actually depriving people of the opportunity to get to know each other in informal ways. By zoning out the corner coffee shop, the bodega, and other things, we don't have the opportunity to bump in to strangers and build community. That was an attractive critique to me. But as I said, they didn't really have a legal device in order to implement it. This is what the device is. So what they came up with, the foundational idea of new urbanist land use regulation is this urban transect, which I believe they borrow from biologists and ecologists, or else they say they do, but they might not be true. Don't ask me. Anyway, so the idea is that urban development naturally proceeds from more dense to less dense. And that really what matters within a certain area of this progression isn't what is being done in a building, but what the building looks like. So that dense urban centers should have buildings appropriate for dense urban centers, and it kind of proceeds out. So in the suburban zone, the Transect T3 zone, it doesn't really matter what's going on in suburban buildings. They can be houses, they can be doctor's offices, they can be Starbucks, but they should look appropriate for the suburban zone. And this is a natural progression that happens sort of everywhere. So again, I don't know if this is entirely unconvincing, but the problem in implementation is that it turns out that what belongs in each of these zones is not very self-evident. And that's where I think these codes raise sort of 4 concerns that I'll highlight, although there are probably more. The first is, despite their billing, these codes are not, they're billed as sort of a simple, straightforward way to have managed diversity and vibrancy, get rid of all that complex zoning stuff. They're not simple and they're not straightforward. They tend to be very, very heavily dominated by architects. They're written by architects. There are lots of architectural renderings, incredibly complicated. One critic of Denver's new zoning code that embraces transect zoning, this is called form, and transect zoning is supplemented by these things, which are called form-based codes. They specify what goes on in the zones. Denver has a form-based zoning code now, as does Cincinnati, Miami, and a number of other cities. One critic of Denver's new zoning code complained that the code is a control freak fantasy. So these are architects. They like to write their architectural preferences into the codes. That's sort of the point. I think that raises 2 really important problems. The first might be called a rule of law problem. They're full of not only architectural renderings, but just sort of bizarre jargon that nobody understands except for new urbanists. This is from a form-based code for an area of Milwaukee that's being redeveloped. But the second kind of illustrates my point about jargoning. Second bullet point, the area behind the glazing must be street activating uses. Street activating uses are those open to the public. Street activating uses can also include areas that are not open to the public, yet still activate the street. So if we think the law, in order to be law, ought to be clear, I mean, when the Supreme Court has a vagueness doctrine, I think that's vague, but even if it's not constitutionally vague, I think it's sort of problematic. It doesn't help that many of these codes, as you go back to the previous picture, it shows appropriate as the design, and then it has appropriate building types, illustrative only. Here is another one from Arlington, Virginia. The X is an example of an inappropriate facade expression, and the other one is an example of an appropriate facade expression. It is beyond me why that one is appropriate and one is not. I actually liked the diversity of the first, but so I have this new urbanist architect friend who I dearly love. He loves the new urbanism. He thinks he really does have an article about why it's required by the natural law. But I'm always telling him, art is not law. It's just not. And he doesn't believe that. I mean, we just can't understand each other. So I just think this is a little bit of a rule of law problem. But even if it's not, it's really expensive. There's plenty of evidence that these are really expensive to comply with. And it's not clear that many inner ring suburbs can actually afford them, despite what they see as this being like this salvific thing. Now, I am from South Bend, Indiana, which is not an inner ring suburb, but has many inner suburban problems. It's an aging post-industrial city with a big university approximate to it, not in it. And we have a very cool mayor, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who is running for president. He just has his new book out. And we always have him come and talk to property classes because he does a lot of good stuff with tearing down abandoned buildings and other things. And he told my class, all 180 property students, the 3 classes, what South Bend needs is a form-based code. And I was like, wait a second, you can't get anyone to redevelop in South Bend, Indiana. Why would you want to make it more expensive? But he has this idea that if we just could have more aesthetic preference, like cool, we'd be really hip. He also has a video about hipsters in South Bend. But anyway, so that's sort of the first 2 problems, and I think the most serious ones is that the sort of art versus law problem. These codes aren't clear, and at the very least, you need an architect to comply with them, and probably a new urbanist architect. And the second is they're expensive. They really are. And some places can't afford to implement them because some places have to essentially pay people to come and develop. The third concern is just probably an economic one, is that the urban transect, this idea that development naturally proceeds from more dense to less, isn't true, at least in the United States, and probably not in most other places either. This is LA. The red dots are the most dense, and it goes out to blue, which is their least dense, and what you see there is there's just density pockets all over LA. It's not more dense to less dense. And so what happens in reality is that what happens often with these transect zones, that's the transect for Bailey's Crossroads, not too far from here. That's not a progression from more dense to less. That's just different design zones. It's sort of an anachronistic idea of how development proceeds. A pre-industrial idea, at least. And then the final sort of rule of law concern, someone sent my paper to one of the founders of the New Urbanism, and she was not pleased with it. But she said that they never use eminent domain to impose the New Urbanist project. I'm not sure these are two examples of where it's being done. I mean, so one problem with using the law to change the aesthetics of a built environment is buildings are harder to get rid of than words. And so if your concern is that the buildings are an impediment to, this redevelopment, sometimes it's tempting to use eminent domain to remove the impediments. There's some irony here, I think, because the New Urbanists, and for one of the reasons that I was attracted to them originally, is they consider people like Jane Jacobs and Vince Scully their forefathers, in a sense. And Jane Jacobs and Vince Scully became famous for critiquing the use of urban renewal to destroy our urban environments on aesthetic grounds in order to replace them with modernist monstrosities that the New Urbanists now would like to destroy on aesthetic grounds in order to replace them with the neighborhoods that look like the ones that Vince Scully and Jane Jacobs were trying to save in the first place. So I mean, there are ironies there, I suppose. I mean, Jane Jacobs, who's one of my heroes, was certainly no fan of using the government to impose aesthetics. 5 minutes, I'm almost done, through the law. But the second is maybe there's just a cautionary tale generally about trying to use the law to impose our aesthetic preferences on the built environment, although the law does it ubiquitously. Okay, so that's sort of my critique. I just want to say, as far as my solutions go, I don't really have one. I don't doubt that some of these places, lots of places, have aesthetic problems. Dead malls are a problem. They are a problem. So I don't know what the answer is. I suspect for many places, especially modest places, many urban suburbs. Oh, sorry, this is just a little graph. I don't even know if it's accurate. I stole it from the internet, but this shows the growth in New Urbanist codes. I think that one thing that shows that they are really becoming more popular is these big cities are now adopting them citywide. Miami, Denver, Cincinnati. So my solution is, my idea would be something like this. Many places in the United States, urban and suburban, probably there is a desire to have diversity, but really cling to the idea that we can manage it carefully, which the market is dangerous. And I think some places, maybe many urban, inner suburban places, need less regulation of land uses, not more. We had this conversation about this book, Learning from Las Vegas, after the Lost Talk. Robert Venturi, one of Vince Scully's students, wrote a book, and he said, look, we can learn from Las Vegas. We think it's so ugly, but in fact, it's a uniquely adaptable American scene. And I think that one of the dangers of this movement toward aesthetic regulation of places is that it takes over, it inhibits our ability to see what is really an eclectic, uniquely American scene that is actually quite adaptable and does a good job for people like my Afghani cab driver. This is one example. This is outside of Indianapolis. This neighborhood is a strip mall. I'm sure it's ugly, but it is actually serving a function for a variety of communities. And the other about adaptability is that's my favorite restaurant in Kansas City, where I grew up. It used to be called Oklahoma Joe's, but now it's spread out. So now it's Joe's Kansas City Barbecue, but I liked Oklahoma Joe's better. But it's in a gas station. So there are these adaptive and I think that's funky. If I was hip, I would really think that was funky. But so I just think that maybe like this, we could really think about land use regulation in these places that need renewal as an opportunity to think creatively, not about more regulation, but less. Thanks.
So Adam, how can we make places more hip?
Oh God, my kids would tell you, I don't know.
So would mine.
So I'm glad you mentioned the Jane Jacobs point of the irony at the end. I mean, reading this is a fun paper to read. I learned a lot from it. As I read it I thought over and over again of that line from a century ago. Herbert Crowley, the founder of the New Republic, said, "We're going to pursue Jeffersonian ends through Hamiltonian means." And I read this and I thought, oh, the new urbanists are pursuing Jane Jacobs' ends through Robert Moses's means. I mean, it's a real irony of that. And unsurprisingly, given my own priors, there's a lot in this paper that I agree with, especially as we talk about the regulatory burdens and costs that are inherently imposed by this form-based codes, form-based zoning. And so, I ultimately think that Nicole's critique is compelling, or at least it confirms my own biases, and that's good enough for me. But of course, I do think there are, in reading through this, it struck me that there are real benefits to be found from form-based zoning. So we should at least reflect upon those a little bit more before concluding that the benefit isn't worth the cost. I mean, ultimately, I think, right, the benefit isn't worth the cost. But the benefits we should at least think about a little bit. But first, let me just start by reiterating and amplifying the points where I think Nicole's diagnosis is correct. And the one we sort of alluded to already, form-based zoning seems inherently more costly than use-based zoning, if only because form-based zoning seems inherently vaguer right now. Use-based zoning is a pretty straightforward regulatory framework. It's clearer and easier to prescribe with precision in codes. It's not perfectly precise, no law is, as any lawyer knows, but it imposes fairly clear and well-established requirements. We know what goes where in this Euclidean zoning framework. Form-based zoning, form-based codes by contrast, seem a framework that's inherently vaguer, in part because it's focusing on aesthetic judgments that are not easily reduced to short, simple instructions. It seems to me what they're trying to do is take tacit knowledge or tacit understandings or tastes and reduce it to writing, which is incredibly hard, right? We all know, some things are, I know it when I see it, right? And reducing aesthetic judgments to form-based codes, it seems like, I know it when I see it, now let me explain it to you. Right? It's extremely difficult to take what's an instinctual taste judgment and then reduce it to writing, at least at first, and I'll get back to that later. But in the short run, this requires either extremely vague rules or extremely voluminous rules, and neither one of them is a friend of the small businesses and homeowners that you're trying to attract to these inner ring suburbs. I liked how Nicole's paper points out or highlights the way that the advocates for form-based codes really downplay the cost and burden of their approach. Oh, it's so simple, it's just these pictures. No, it's much more complicated than that. And those costs, the regulatory compliance costs, fall most heavily, as almost always, on small businesses and homeowners, which are precisely the entrepreneurs and the immigrants. I don't mean international, I just mean local immigrants that inner ring suburbs are trying to attract to their community as opposed to the urban areas or neighboring suburbs. And so the regulatory costs and burdens become incredibly important, and the fact that the new urbanists are really glossing past that is astonishing to me. And in terms of the rule of law issue, the vague laws raise basic questions of due process, and this was brought out beautifully by Justice Gorsuch in an opinion earlier this year called DiMaia versus Sessions. It had to do with an intersection of immigration and criminal law. And this passage, I wrote it down, just pardon me for quoting at length, but I think it nails it. Gorsuch writes for the court, "Vague laws invite arbitrary power. Before the Revolution, the crime of treason in English law was so capaciously construed that the mere expression of disfavored opinions could invite transportation or death." He cites the Declaration of Independence, and he says, "Today's laws may not be as invidious," that's an understatement, "but they can invite the exercise of arbitrary power all the same, by leaving the people in the dark about what the law demands and allowing prosecutors and courts and zoning boards to make it up." I think that illustrates perfectly this sense there's just a problem with vague laws. Then, of course, Gorsuch points out there's also real separation of powers questions. Who's actually making the law? The equivalent of the legislature or the equivalent of the executive? And of course, in local government, I don't teach it, I don't study it, but I understand it's much more complicated than just legislature and executive. But still, if nothing else, vague laws create regulatory uncertainty, which deters investment and development that's hard to measure. How many businesses didn't locate to an inner ring suburb because of its code? How many jobs were not created there because of its complicated code? We'll never really know with any certainty. The other thing is form-based zoning. It presumes aesthetic tastes of an elite class, which may be foreign or even off-putting to the residents themselves. And this comes across really well. I marked down page 32. I think that's the page where you actually have that. I think it makes the point. This, the picture on the right, that's what the local residents need, right? It's what seems familiar to them. It might seem foreign to the new urbanists and whatever their particular aesthetic judgments are, but, who are they to judge? We'll get back to that in a second. So in the end, the reformers are trying to be simultaneously progressive and conservative, progressive towards their vision of a better future, but in a way that presumes the superiority or certain older aesthetic tastes. And in a way, the progressives are making future progress and evolution more difficult by locking in the particular tastes of particular times. My bottom line is this strikes me as a giant homeowners association, which, having recently lived in an HOA neighborhood, I know firsthand, has real downsides, and I don't know that it's a good way to run a city. On the other hand, I liked my old neighborhood, right? Because in spite of all the pains that the HOA inflicted on me, on annual architectural audits, I knew what the neighborhood looked like, and I moved there because I liked what it looked like, and I knew that it would basically look like that later. And it encouraged me to invest my time and resources in the neighborhood, right? I was investing in something much more certain, because certain, at least in terms of aesthetics. And so that's why I do have some sympathy for the aesthetic critique of inner-ring suburbs. It creates a stable, predictable environment that in its own way helps induce investment. The other thing I thought of in reading the paper, in addition to Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses, was James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, right, and their famous broken windows theory of policing, right, the idea that the aesthetic environment does have its own impact on the way that the citizens lead their lives and either attract or repel people to a neighborhood. And so I do think that, in a way, the broken windows theory was itself an aesthetic theory, right? The idea that when people see things, they react in certain ways, and they make certain assumptions and certain predictions about what the legal environment is actually going to allow and what the culture is going to allow. And so for the same reason that I'm attracted to Wilson and Kelling's broken windows theory, maybe there's something to be said for a beautiful windows theory, right, or whatever you want to call the aesthetic judgment. And so, again, it's just one benefit, I think. Throughout all this, I want to make clear, I think Nicole's ultimately right, but here's what we're losing. We're losing a little bit of this. The other thing, I joked before about aesthetic rules being so hard to reduce to code, right? I know it when I see it, now let me explain it to you at length. In a way, it's because it's this challenge up front to take tacit knowledge and reduce it to specific writing. It's hard to do at first, but over time, these terms could become more understandable, right? All this new urbanist jargon might not make any sense to us right now, but over time, we might come to understand tacitly what's meant by the code by just observing it in practice, right? That over time, the compliance costs could come down. Now, that doesn't help the fact that the compliance costs are up front at the exact moment you're trying to attract people to the neighborhood, right? But I'm just saying over time, the compliance costs could be reduced. And then the last point I make is aesthetics are important because beauty is important, right? Any conservative who's read Roger Scruton knows this. I take it seriously because Roger Scruton takes this seriously. And as I was reading your paper, I thought back to some things Scruton wrote a few years ago. He wrote two papers for AEI. One of them is called A Plea for Beauty, a Manifesto for a New Urbanism. And then there's another one. And he contrasts the British attitude towards zoning laws and aesthetics and the British attitude and the American attitude. And on the American attitude, which is naturally more libertarian, which bristles at the impositions that what do we call them, aestheticians, aesthetes, whatever. Scruton says this American attitude has something healthy about it, but it tends to go with two quite erroneous assumptions about beauty and the aesthetic. The first assumption is that beauty is an entirely subjective matter about which there can be no reasoned argument and concerning which it is futile to search for a consensus. The second assumption, congenial to those who adopt the first, is that beauty doesn't matter, and that it is a value without economic reality, which cannot be allowed to place any independent constraint on the workings of the market. He says, this is the aesthetic cost. People need beauty. They need the sense of being at home in the world and being in communication with other souls. I think that's correct. When I said earlier, I don't like this elite deciding what's beautiful and not, it's not to say I reject entirely the idea that it's good sometimes to have elites making judgments about beauty. We might disagree with them, we might argue about them vociferously, but I'm enough of a conservative to know that sometimes the immediate views of the of individuals, and even a majority, doesn't necessarily prove correct. And I would like it if Roger Scruton were designing our neighborhoods, not the new urbanists, but Roger Scruton might do a nice job. And so there is something to be said for the endeavor. Unfortunately, we don't always get to pick the planners. So ultimately, I agree with Nicole that form-based zoning in its current form seems too costly and is probably counterproductive. But that's a reality that I think is probably one to be mourned, not celebrated. In any event, my ultimate suggestion for Nicole as she finalizes this wonderful paper is to read Roger Scruton. But of course, that's advice that I give to anyone, anytime. So thank you.
Well, because I'm married to my husband, I listen to lots of Roger Scruton podcasts. Can I respond really quickly? Backwards, starting with Roger Scruton. So look, I'm going to say that I said I agree with the aesthetic. We put a front porch on our house, very new urbanist thing to do, and it did actually change the way we interacted with our neighbors. So I agree that their beauty matters. I actually think one thing to think about is whether this is about old suburbs or just generally the enterprise. Some places can afford it more than others. The other thing to think about is the only reason the new urbanists are able to succeed legally is that they have already, in some sense, won the cultural war, so that these aesthetics may be imposed anyway. If you look at where they build modern malls now, they don't look like the malls of my teenage days. They look the aesthetic is already very much in the mainstream of development. So it's not clear that you need the codes. The new urbanists believe that you need the codes for the third reason that you stated, is that we have forgotten what good design is, and that we must be reminded through the law, and that over time the need for that reminder will go away. And I think that is the critique, and I can understand that there is something perhaps to that. And then on the your homeowners association point and the kind of these are insurance that if you buy into this community, it's going to look a certain way. I actually think that's a big part of why local governments do this. I mean, someone challenged me in the spring, like, why would local governments, given political realities, adopt these things? I think part of it is a bargain with the homeowners. So we really think we need to have more mixing of uses, and we know that makes you nervous about your home values. So if you let us do this, these codes will make it safe and protect we won't have broken windows. And I think that is part of the political reality for the reason that these are being adopted. And that might be one reason why maybe they're okay in some places, because otherwise we'll get more diversity. And if they're not being adopted, by the way, through the zoning codes, I suspect very much they're being adopted through the PUD process, where developers are being told they must do this in order to get subdivision permission.
So some of what you guys just said in this exchange anticipates this a little bit, but I'm wondering if if we could distinguish usefully between form-based zoning and dumb form-based zoning, because it seems like part of the problem, I'm tempted to say part of the problem are the vague and like the silly ones about street activating uses are any use that activates the street, including but not limited to. So you could imagine if you had a rule of law mentality, coming up with at least like a couple of clear rules that nudge things in this direction, like your parking lot has to be in the back, not in the front, so that your store is along the sidewalk. I take it that's part of what street activating use is really about. Or you get a benefit if you have retail on the ground floor of your apartment building, you can have an extra story. Or so it wouldn't fully capture the aesthetic. But we thought even part of the problem was just an externality that's maybe a little cheaper or a little more convenient for your customers to have the parking lot right there, but a lot prettier for everybody if we put it in the back. We could nudge people towards things that work for everybody. So I wonder, and now maybe you could say, no, it never works that way. Like this is the libertarian problem is somebody says, look, there's a lot of inefficient regulation, and then the naive progressive me comes in and says, oh, let's have better regulation. And the answer is there are systematic reasons to think we're never going to get better regulation. You're only going to get the bad kind or the dumb kind. But I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so I think some of the early appeal of the new urbanism was the fact that they would say exactly that. Like, look, zoning requires you to have so many parking places that every single person who might think about coming to the mall on Christmas Eve gets one, right? So that's just stupid. So let's say we're going to have very limited on-street parking, and you have to put the parking lot in the back, and you only have to have half of the number of parking spaces. Or that we are going to permit what is not currently permitted, which is apartments over stores. So some of this it just could be smart regulation. and many of the early sort of moves were deregulatory or re-regulatory in a way that made sense, that promoted both kind of urban vitality and aesthetics. But I think that there's this sort of the next step where we get into the details.
It depends on the price of the parking. If it's very cheap, then there's nothing wrong with having enough for everyone who wants to come on Christmas Eve.
Well, right, but the regulations are often driven by the civil engineers. I mean, the old zoning regulations are driven by civil engineers who have specific ideas about how many parking places you have to have per square foot of, retail space. And so there's a fight. I mean, it's not just the price of the parking. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that parking regulations are brutally expensive for very modest people. For example, I did a paper on accessory dwelling units with my colleague Peg Brenning. It was an empirical paper that showed like when California mandated accessory dwelling units in suburbs, what would happen is the city would say, you can have an accessory dwelling unit, that's fine, but you have to have 2 off-street parking spots for every 1 bedroom. So this is like for grandma, right? So I do think that the traditional zoning rules about things like parking and about how wide streets needed to be were driven a lot by old ideas of urban planning that were very dictated by civil engineers and not by architects and good design.
So I think that this paper really breaks ground in a way that few of the papers we have do, because you took the time and trouble to actually take this thing seriously, which I have to say honestly I would never have done, because I would have missed a lot by not doing that. And I think that I want to build on Adam's comments and also Will's to say I think there's some obvious things to do empirically that nobody would have thought of if you hadn't written this paper. And so let me just say what you could do in a next step, maybe with an economist co-author or something. So what are the economic principles that are going to help us figure out what the likely effects of this are? Adam, I'll rephrase what Adam said. Well, there's a communitarian argument based on coordination that could justify this from the standpoint of increasing value. So there's an argument to be made that maybe these formal standards could increase value, which is in principle testable because there's cross-sectional variation. There's also an argument, which Will said, which is again within that, to the extent that there's cross-sectional variation in terms of how definitive these rules are, you would expect there could be differential value creation. That is, something that creates an aesthetic standard might create value, and something that creates uncertainty while doing that might actually reduce value. And then third, it seems like there's a pretty clear economic principle, which I learned many years ago, called the Le Chatelier principle. That's how we get paid a lot in economics, is we use French names for things. But the basic point of the Le Chatelier principle is that any time you impose, all things equal, if you impose a constraint on something, you make it more expensive. So it's got to be clear that the distributional aspects of this are very adverse to low-income people. I don't see a way you're going to get, I can see how the consequence is. There's a communitarian argument that if this is done in a certain way without a lot of uncertainties being created, that might increase property value. I don't see how you're going to make the argument that this is going to entice a more diverse, economically diverse population. So I think teasing out a little bit more of those kinds of economic arguments and then thinking about how you could create a panel database would be a really exciting next project.
I'm Elaine Middleman. I'm an attorney in private practice. And a couple quick things, and then I just make a point. First of all, I'm from Indiana, so if you could tell us where you said that was.
It's outside of Indianapolis.
I know where, what town or what?
I think it's on the northern.
It's not, can't be Carmel.
No, it's not. It's not Carmel. It's on the northern border of Indianapolis. But
You don't know.
I don't know.
Okay.
But it's not Carmel. It's
Right. It's definitely not Carmel. Anyway, that's
it actually maybe this is a statement against interest, because I think it may actually be inside. It may be at the fringe of Indianapolis. I don't know which side. It's not Carmel. It's obviously not a wealthy suburb place,
Right.
Suburban place.
for those of you who don't know, that's part of what I was going to say was that I'm not sure. Didn't really follow your paper that much, but distinguishing in close-in suburbs like here, Arlington is pretty upscale versus farther out suburbs, and I'm not sure. Like Fairfax County is huge, so I'm not sure that there's that much differentiation. But my specific question was, I've worked for a long time on a case, not suburbs in Washington D.C., where they took the property by eminent domain, and there was supposed to be a Walmart there, and then they went through the PUD process, and the whole thing collapsed because Walmart backed out. And so all the expense of the PUD process and the hearings with the architects, they were like, well, I think you need more lighting on the third floor, et cetera. And I'm like, the thing's not going to happen at all. So, I mean, there were like gigantic books of stuff and years of processing and hearings that I'm trying to follow up to find out how much that actually costs, because Walmart is not there. And the people who had their property taken, and I represented some of them, they were not allowed to become, quote unquote, interested parties because they no longer had the property, but the next door neighbors were allowed to be interested parties. So the whole process was just ludicrous, I think. So.
Right. I mean, on your point about Carmel versus, I don't know, whatever, or Arlington, I mean, it's a definitional issue. Not all entering suburbs are have any problems. Some of them are super wealthy. Arlington has changed a lot since I lived here 20 years ago, where it really was. It had more of an inner ringy feel. Now it's much, it's really upscaled. It's new urban upscaled. But they even have several new urbanist codes. But so I do think that that's one of the problems on the critique of inner suburbs generally. They're not monolithic places. But your point about the Walmart, I mean, probably what happened is the people in the process didn't ever want a Walmart. So, I think that is a rule of law question that we could think about.
Could I just say, Walmart didn't want to go there, and Walmart was going to go other places, which they did in D.C., but the mayor of D.C. gave Walmart an ultimatum that they had to go to this location also.
Oh,
so
I
that's
see.
why they went through this whole process, and then at the end, Walmart said, we're not going there.
But I do think that this sort of death by 1,000 paper cuts, which is part and parcel to this, but the Venn diagrams they overlap, but certainly not complete, is a real law question that it's very hard to get your head around. And we mostly ignore, right? So the amount of time and effort that it goes into getting approval to do stuff, especially if the local government doesn't want you to do it. They can just drag it on forever, and there is not much you can do about it, except just, like you said, give up and leave.
Yes. Be sure to identify yourself.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Steven Vukovitz. I'm actually a Notre Dame undergrad, so I share your sentiments about Mayor Pete.
I didn't share my sentiments about Mayor Pete, just about Mayor Pete's views on this.
Yes. Yeah, that's fair. I was wondering, sort of in a similar vein to the question that was asked earlier, on the homogenization, do these new urbanists intend for everyone within these inner ring suburbs to sort of meet the same standard of economic being able to afford certain living buildings, or do they make plans to set off pieces of the city for lower income housing, or do they implement something? I know President Obama had some sort of executive order mandating a certain percentage of racial diversity in neighborhoods. Do they balance that, or do they sort of just go?
Well, if we want to talk about regulatory overreach, we might start with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which is the Obama thing. I mean, it's a great question. I think most folks who favor these things, the same way that folks who favor growth controls, would say that you can offset the cost with other regulatory devices like inclusionary zoning. So if you do this, then you have to set aside, in order to develop here, you must set aside 10% of the units, which is done with some success in places where the property is very expensive and people are willing to absorb those costs, like New York City, Manhattan, and not as effectively in other places. I think that's a different question because a lot of times the subsidies are quite deep and for people who are lower middle income and not necessarily the people who are the poorest. But that debate about inclusionary zoning and the structure of it is sort of part of the new urbanism, but really not as much what I'm talking about. No, I think it's a great idea. I mean, methodologically, as you say, we need an economist, but I think they're all quite interesting. I mean, these places do increase, places that are successfully implemented, especially in the PUD process, like new urbanist developments, often have higher housing prices. So wealthy people like them. People will buy into them, but they have to have distributional consequences. And, you know, I think you and Will both raised this question, could you find two different places with different levels of detail? I suspect the answer is yes. There are only so many people writing these codes. There's specialized firms that are contracted to the local governments. So I don't know how much variation there is. Ideally, I mean, to your point, ideally there'd be a ton of variation. The neurologists would say, and I believe that they do not want a uniform aesthetic in the whole world. They think that different places could have a different aesthetic. But the codes, it's not a huge universe of code writers out there. Mayor Pete legal department is not going to write a form-based code for South Bend. They're going to hire somebody from the Form-Based Code Institute.
I was confused by the discussion, and I'm not so shy that I'll avoid revealing it. You know, first of all, I didn't know that Vin Scully had any expertise outside of baseball, so that was something that I was glad to find out. I guess I didn't understand the issue because at first I thought this was something that would be imposed from on high, but since Charlie got to mention Le Chatelier, I'll mention Thibault because he sounds kind of French too. That you know, if this idea
he had any expertise off the football field.
Yeah, that's spelled differently, but you're right. But I mean, in the sense that if you look at your map of Chicago, and you know, the first suburb north of Chicago is Evanston, which is doing fine, and so to speak, and the first one south is Harvey. And Harvey didn't turn into Harvey because of a lack of aesthetics. It turned into Harvey for some basically fundamental economic reasons. If this is simply a model that's out there that isn't imposed by a central authority in Springfield or something like that, and it's just competition, and I don't see what the issue is. If some suburbs want to adopt this, more power to them, and they come to Adam's point where now we've got, you know, building regulations and how much stone is in your house versus stucco and things like that, and that's going to increase some value. But to Charlie's point, I agreed with him. I had the same idea about, well, let's just look at changes in value when we've got this time series of cross sections of places that have it. But that suffers from the problem that plagues a lot of these things, like putting in the football stadium or something, or attracting a new business to an area. Yeah, the property values go up there, but it's all just really redistributable across space. It doesn't tell you anything about the social value of these things, or doesn't tell you much about the social value. And I also agree with Charlie's point that, you know, if you could make Harvey into an aesthetically beautiful place, but the people who live in Harvey now are not the ones who are going to benefit from that. They're going to lose.
I mean, on your first point, I will say, look, this is, I mean, I say in my paper, in some ways, the laudable thing about this is it's TO competition. The local governments are saying we have one power that we're going to use to impose this, that we're going to try something new in order to attract different residents and improve our economic circumstances. I think that's right, but I'm not sure that the fact that a local government does something necessarily immunizes it from concerns about violations of the rule of law. I mean, Vicki Bean has a great paper where she says, why are we concerned about land use exactions in the takings context? Because Thibault says that, you know, there's competition for development, and if people overprice development, the city's overpriced development, the developers will just go elsewhere. But the Supreme Court still says there's a constitutional issue with exactions. Maybe they're wrong, but I mean, I think local governments can do things that are expropriative, that are dumb, that are bad, and the fact that the local government is doing it and there are options, that opt-out, the exit possibility, helps us feel better about it, but I don't know if it necessarily means that we shouldn't be concerned about it.
maybe this is the point that I missed then. So how does this particular aesthetically based land use regulation differ from any other kind of land use regulation that would be subject to the same abuses? Is it in the vagueness that leaves room for people who would violate the rule of law, or what?
I might reveal a lot if I really told you how much concern I have about a lot of abuses of land use regulation at the local level. But maybe I could make that. Maybe you're right. It's just like a lot of other things that local governments do that are sort of, kind of tyrannical. That impose tons of costs on local government, on landowners, and some of them they do through the zoning rules, and some of them they do through the planning process, and some of them they do, the subdivision process that are deeply concerning. This is just a new version of an old story. I mean, to your point about homeowners associations, I mean, if it's not done through the zoning code, a lot of local governments are likely encouraging this kind of thing through covenants. And then I would maybe say, well, I'm not as worried about it because people have entry and exit. So I mean, I guess I take your point. I think it's a valid one. It may just be a different version of the same story. And to Ab's point about how zoning seems more straightforward, it's true, but there's very little development as of right in the United States. Just because you're in a residential neighborhood doesn't mean you get to residential zone doesn't mean you get to build a house. Like, you just don't get to start digging a hole, right? There's so much discretion that goes into the development process, and lots of it does raise sort of what I would call rule of law concerns.
Can I say just one thing?
Of course.
Yeah, for me, that was for me the strongest point, or the point that grabbed me the most out of her paper was how in the short term it is almost impossible to reduce these aesthetic judgments to a meaningfully precise code. I was just thinking, as a lawyer, as a recovering lawyer, how would I begin to comply with some of these things? Or as a homeowner, I mean, it's extremely difficult, and I don't know, I know even less about economics than I do about land use planning. But this T-boot competition is a long-run competition, right? In the long run, there's going to be winners and losers. I mean, in the short run, too, but I mean, it's something that takes time. And in the meantime, as these things shake out, it takes one city council, imposing this code once to wreak, real havoc on a community for 10 or 20 years. And 10 or 20 years is the lifetime of a family with kids in a house. I mean, that is the story of their family, is 20 years in a house where they're unable to, or a business where they're unable to do what they want to do. I mean, it really seems to me that there are real incentive problems or principal agent problems with the government. A mayor could do something, or a city council could do something very quickly and be long gone before the costs are really obvious, right? The residents have exit options, but I bet that the government tends to exit more quickly than the residents do. And the residents are the ones that are left grappling with the ramifications of the law long after the mayor and the city council.
I've never known a government to exit. What a nice idea.
But the officials do.
I have 4 names on the queue, and let's take 5 minutes out of the 15-minute break so we can get a couple of those, but let's try to be brief. I believe your name is Charles, right?
First of all, I was going to suggest that it's such a good article that you have when you pull the trigger on it, you have a couple 100-word version aimed at the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, because I think this has a lot of curb appeal, if you will.
Thank you.
And secondly, I think there's a dimension of this outside the economics. We're in an era of populist reaction right now. And people don't recognize this readily, but everybody knows that the opposite of a liberal is a conservative. But they don't know, from looking at your Wikipedia, that the opposite of a populist is an elitist. And this is they always want you to eat your vegetables. And in the areas of urban planning, what you always get are things like where they start designing roads to go one way, exactly the way you don't want to go. And there is, in England, where this is probably, land use has got thousands of years behind it, this is tamped down so tightly that the only social escape, pressure reliever, is people have their little fiddles that they design to get around the law. So I think that one of the things outside the economic impacts of this is the sort of social rebellion that you'll see. Finally, Adam's comment about 100 years ago, Jefferson ends with Hamiltonian means. 50 years ago, there was a band created called Tower of Power. They're performing tonight at the Birchmere and tomorrow night. Their most famous song is called What is Hip? And I loved your use of hipsters, and their motto has become the most famous line from this most famous song. What is hip today might become passé.
Thanks.
Daniel?
Yes. Well, I want to endorse what you said, Nicole, about that urbanism doesn't necessarily go from high density to low density. I am familiar with Latin American cities because I'm from Venezuela. And if you go to Caracas, or if you go to Bogota, or if you go to many other cities, the suburbs are completely irregular. There are no suburbs like people understand them here in America. Actually, the outer skirts of cities are buildings because it's safer to live in a building than in a house. So that's one of the reasons apartments have more value. And then there are slums, which are completely different and more high density than suburbs. So, of course, you know, it has no natural law of urbanism. But I also want to point out that the Recent Foundation recently had a report exactly about zoning laws. Mm-hmm. And they put up this case about this guy who lives in D.C., actually, who he wanted to, you know, have this new house that is very modern, new, like, eco-friendly techniques. It's very small and very efficient, but it's smaller than allowed by law. So he cannot say that he permanently lives there because it's illegal. And he cannot keep it in the same place all the time because it's illegal. So I think that there's a lot of economic cost to doing this, and there might also be environmental consequences to this. And to the commentary about competition among local governments, even though it is true that there's competition among local governments, that doesn't mean that local governments don't impose burdens on their citizens and that the measures are just going to be neutral on net. I think anything that adds up to the cost, it's going to be negative.
So Christos, and then John Wallace, and then we'll give Nicole the last word.
Yeah, so I want to kind of echo one of the things that Bob said in a more general framework, which is that TBU has a lot of value, and living in a society with respect to libertarian rules, in which people in communities can decide what collectively rules they want to have, is a really important thing. It doesn't mean that we should have communities with no rules, right? That we should somehow prohibit organized collective activity. And so I think this is, you know, this one's on the tipping point of how we think about how that works. But we live, and you know, I think we live in a society in which there's a lot of diversity and there's a lot of tools to organize. And sometimes those tools produce bad outcomes. And on average, I suspect they produce good outcomes.
It's funny that you say that, because I was thinking, I always teach the Euclid case where the Supreme Court upholds zoning, and I tell my students this is a big historic moment, because when the court starts thinking about zoning as a communal activity that allows this community to protect itself instead of this imposition on property rights. And so there is a line there. I mean, that's what most Americans think about land use planning, I think, is it's sort of an insurance policy. Anyway, that doesn't mean there's not abuses. I mean, that's an interesting point. So one of the things that new urbanists often say is that, you know, urban areas would have higher levels of social capital because of the Starbucks effect, or the bodega effect, or the bar effect. Jane Jacobs famously said that neighborhoods with bars would be safer because there would be people have reason to be out in the neighborhood all night long. It turns out that's really not true. But there's also evidence that the prediction that cities would have higher social capital than suburbs is actually completely wrong. I mean, that people in the suburbs know their neighbors better and have stronger social ties. Whether they have the kinds of weaker social ties with strangers that make urban areas functional is a different question. But all the evidence that I've ever read is that the guesses about social capital and urban versus suburban it's intuitively maybe appealing, but maybe not correct.
So thank you. And,